Welcome to episode 496. A new report has diagnosed what combination of beliefs leads a person to endorse political violence. But did we really need a study to tell us that? Then, in response to last week's interview, Phil wants to talk about how our belief in human goodness explains the rise of authoritarianism and populism. Plus, why are U.S. Christians endorsing the Freedom Convoy in Canada? Then I talked to Glenn Packiam about his new book, The Resilient Pastor, and all the new Barna data about what's affecting our pastors and why so many of them want to leave ministry. A few more things before we jump into the episode. Once again, Christian was recording on the road as she travels, and this time her internet connection wasn't that reliable, so unfortunately there are some gaps and lags and talking over one another. We apologize for that, but it's the best we could do with what we had. Apart from that technical announcement, we have two really exciting announcements. We are just weeks away from our 500th episode, and we never would have gotten this far without the help of our Patreon supporters. So we're inviting you to help participate in the 500th episode, and there's two ways you can do that. First, you can submit a voice message sharing your favorite Holy Post memory. It could be an episode, a story, a guest, or some other moment, or maybe just a general message about how the Holy Post has been meaningful to you. We're actually going to select some of your voice messages and use them on episode 500. The second way to participate in celebrating this milestone is by helping us design special episode 500 merchandise. You can submit your own design, and we're going to select one winner to use on all of our special 500th episode Holy Post merchandise. So if you want to participate in either of these ways, the voice messages or the merch contest, go to holypost.com and hit the Support Us button, where you'll be taken to our Patreon page with all the details. Again, we're super grateful for all of your support to get us this far, and we can't wait to celebrate with you in a couple of weeks. Okay, here is episode 496.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. This is Phil Vischer. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
And Christian Taylor beaming in from Laurel, Mississippi. Hey, Christian.
Hey, y'all.
And Jason's on the horn from somewhere slightly west and south of me.
Yep.
Yep, exactly. Jason, did you walk today? Did you walk
I
yet?
did. I got back like a half hour ago, so hopefully no one can tell I'm still a little, I was all covered up in
You're spitzing,
like a hat
as they
and
say.
a coat and everything, and it kind of, I don't know, it was like it was drippy out there, like everyth's kind of
drippy.
all the trees were kind of drippy and everything, so yeah, it's kind of gross.
I don't think I've ever described my environment as drippy, but I like that. That's kind of interesting. And here's a theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Christian is on a whirlwind tour of the South. Are you part of the team that's dismantling Confederate statues? Is that why you're driving all over the South?
Well, I did think about that when I was in Oxford, Mississippi, and saw that Confederate statue. And then there was one at the courthouse in my hometown of Laurel, Mississippi. And I thought, I bet you no one's talking about removing these. But I didn't do anything about that.
You should go up to the statue, the Confederate statue in your own hometown, just with a hammer and just start hitting it like in the knees. Who is it? Is it Robert Lee? Who is it?
I would never do that. And I would never, with my own name, actually say a single word about removing it. Otherwise, I would be forever martyred. But I guess that's the point.
Oh.
I stand convicted in my own words.
Yeah.
Yeah. I should probably.
Your Southern accent.
Yeah. You notice the accent?
Yes, your Southern accent is stronger.
Yeah, I've been told that happens sometimes. I've been down here for a week, so
this is
it's affecting you, definitely.
Can't wait to talk to you after you've been down there for a couple of months.
How come when you go to France for that long, you don't pick up a French accent?
Yeah. What's that all about?
Fortunately, I don't know how to speak that language.
Oh. Maybe you should learn. That might help with the whole, doing lots of stuff in France thing. Okay. It is, as we record this will come out on Wednesday, but as we're recording, it is Valentine's Day. It is February 14th. It is that blessed Christian high holy day. Skye, tell us the history of Valentine's Day and why all Christians should celebrate it in church.
So Saint Francis was a doctor in Rome, I believe.
Saint Francis? Who's Saint
I mean,
Francis?
not Saint Francis. Saint Valentine. Sorry, Saint Francis. Getting my
Wrong
saints confused.
saint.
Saint Valentine he was a doctor in Rome, wasn't he?
Yeah, and he was a cardiologist. He fixed hearts, broken hearts.
No, I think and he was a Christian, obviously, and I think the story goes that there was a blind girl that he was trying to help, and he was trying to put some ointment on her eyes or something to heal her blindness. I'm gonna get this butchered. I'm sure Wikipedia has it right.
Okay.
Jason, can you look this up to correct him?
And wait, let me see if I get this right though. But he eventually gets arrested by the authorities for being a Christian, and he's killed for being a Christian.
Yeah.
But before he left, he gave a note to this girl and her father about wanting to care for her. And then like her eyes were miraculous. Her sight was miraculously restored by something he had given her. And that's where the whole idea of giving notes on Valentine's
Day. And his
Day.
note was heart-shaped and had ruffles around the edges.
Yeah, and some Hershey's chocolate.
Yeah, had chocolates. Okay. That's great. That's an inspiring story. That's an inspiring
story. It is about
story.
Christians and martyrdom and healing and love.
Oh, the note actually said "from your Valentine."
There you go.
That's where that comes from.
From your
Valentine,
no
meaning
way!
himself, because he was Valentine. But,
yes. So when we say "from your Valentine," we are taking the role of a saint, Saint Valentine, and saying we're him. Interesting. I did not know that. Okay, I have a story just for Valentine's Day, which I think everyone's really going to enjoy because they love my special stories for special occasions. It is not butt related. I'll just throw that out there. We're not going there for Valentine's Day, but it's animal. It's kind of, yeah, I know you're broken up about it. It is animal related. Biohybrid fish powered by beating human heart cells swims for 100 days.
Interesting.
Okay, yeah. So if you're looking for the perfect Valentine's gift for your Valentine, what could be better, I ask, than a robot fish powered by your own human heart?
That is very creepy.
Researchers at Harvard and Emory University have created a biohybrid fish out of human heart muscle cells that can swim autonomously for months at a time as the cells beat. The trick is that this biohybrid fish has a layer of cardiac cells on each side of its tail fin that contract and stretch in an alternating pattern. Each time a muscle stretches or contracts, it opens a protein channel that's sensitive to the movement, which triggers the opposite motion in the other side. A pacemaker-like node helps keep the frequency and rhythm on track, creating an ongoing closed-loop system, allowing the fish to swim around under its own power for over 100 days, powered solely by your love.
So they didn't actually make a fish. They made a little contraption that has human heart tissue that contracts on either side, so it pulls the tail back and forth. But there's no...
Yeah, but it's shaped like a fish.
Fine, but it's a device.
Yes, it's a device. It's a biohybrid. It's like those robots, cyborgs. It's a cyborg. It's actually more like a piece of plastic with some heart muscles taped to it. But I'm going to call it a cyborg. And someday in the future, we're going to have to hunt it down.
And what is the scientific value of this whole thing?
Oh, you are so quick to jump to practical requests.
I was actually about
on this research.
I was about to just say that. You took my line, Skye.
Sorry,
the team says that the biohybrid fish actually, now this is where it gets either more romantic or creepier. I'm not sure which. The team says that the biohybrid fish actually got better over the first month. As the cardiomyocyte cells matured, the muscle coordination, contraction amplitude, and the swimming speed of the fish increased. It got better at swimming over time. Eventually, the biohybrid was able to swim about as fast and effectively as a live zebrafish. Powered by your love.
So isn't that just like any muscle tissue? It gets stronger with use?
Well, it was actually growing because, it's the muscle, because it was Stem cells. It was human stem cells, so they were continuing to grow. Yes, and they got stronger. Yeah, and it swam.
Okay, again,
better.
what's the point?
Do you think your wife would like this as a gift if they could make it from your own heart cells? Like they take heart cells out of Skye Jitani and they build a Skye Jitani fish powered by Skye's heart, and you give it to Amanda. What does she say?
Gross. That's what she says. She says gross. Now, the only thing that would make it redeemable is if when you put a picture of Amanda, or if she's standing by that fish, if the heart muscle beats quicker, then it would be like, oh, look, it's swimming faster because it's Skye's heart muscle. And
if it follows Amanda around the pool, it's like,
right,
I love
it's a stalker fish.
And if it said very quietly, I love you, I love you.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say.
If it tried to say Amanda, is it turning into Frankenstein fish? I love you, Amanda. I am not a monster.
You sound like Rocky Balboa.
I am your heart fish. Adrian! The work isn't about building better robots. It's about understanding the heart in more detail to help study diseases like arrhythmia and eventually even to build better replacement hearts. Because someday we need to know we're all going to have ruined our own hearts. So we're all going to need new hearts. And we need to know how you grow new human hearts. Apparently in aquariums or in the ocean. And then the hearts, when you need one, you go to the ocean, you go to the sea, and a new heart swims up to you and climbs in your ear. I'm not sure exactly what happens next, but you get a new heart from the sea the way God intended it. Thank you. Happy Valentine's Day.
Can we get this team together with that team that made the fish car from like a month or so ago that we were talking about?
Yeah. So Skye's heartfish could actually drive around Wheaton following his wife Amanda, saying, I love you, Amanda. I love you. You know those videos of the dogs saying I love you? The dogs barking. That's what it would sound like, a barking heartfish of Skye.
Right.
You good? Are you?
Yeah.
You want me to explore this story anymore?
I think you should make this into some kind of animated kids special.
What's
that show? There's that show, the animated show with this really smart goldfish.
Yeah, I don't.
American Dad, is that show?
Is it? Maybe. I didn't watch that show. I don't know. I don't watch those naughty shows, Skye. I don't watch shows that swear or talk about sex or make fun of people. So I just watch Mr. Rogers on loop. That's the only show I can watch. Okay. Last week on the show, Christian, is there anything else you'd like to add about my Valentine's special episode story?
Well, the only thing I could say is I just love your heart, Phil.
Thank you. Would you like it to be in a fish following you around the pool?
Definitely not.
Okay. Moving on. So last week, Skye did you listen to last week's show, everybody? I'm not talking to you people here. I'm talking to you people at home. Did you listen to last week's show? Because some of the most interesting stuff I thought, besides all the stuff that, that I did up front in the front half, which was fascinating. The interview Skye had with name. Oh, I got it. Robert McKenzie.
He goes by his middle name, Tracy.
He does? Oh,
yeah.
Okay. It's Robert Tracy McKenzie, but we call him Tracy McKenzie.
Right.
Okay. I guessed wrong. When you have three names, it's, like, which is this one and that one, or this one?
I made that mistake too when we first got on the interview. And he's like, I go by my middle name. So then I figured it out.
So it seemed like the moral of the story last week was that what we really need in the church, in America at least, if not elsewhere, is a little more Calvinism.
I wouldn't say just Calvinism, but just Orthodox Christian theology of humanity.
And what I found interesting was, because I'd never really thought about the connection between believing that people are generally good, which the founding fathers did not believe people were generally good. But within a couple of generations, that idea started to pop up more and more in America, that we Americans are generally good. Maybe, the British are bad and the French, I don't know about the French, and Canadians, who can trust them with all their Tim Hortons instead of Dunkin'. So maybe they're bad, but we Americans are generally good. And how that links to an openness to more authoritarian leaders. Because if we're good and they're one of us, that means they'll do what's right. That I thought was really interesting.
And the missing link there is if we're generally good and we pick our leaders through democratic processes, then the leaders we pick must be really good. So if we happen to pick an authoritarian via democracy, it must be okay.
It'll be a good authoritarian. Right. And that's what we need, because that's, Jesus is a good authoritarian when he comes back with the sword in his mouth and all that.
Skye, isn't that like what you talk about making God in our own image?
Yeah, that's Voltaire, however. I'm quoting Voltaire. He said, if God created us in his image, we've returned the favor.
Yeah, so it sounds
Don't be humble, Skye. I think Voltaire is quoting you.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's the same thing that we are doing with our politicians these days, huh?
Yeah, but the breakdown is, as Phil said, it's when we believe we are really good, then we project that. So it isn't just bad that we project our identity onto a god or onto a politician or onto a leader. It starts with when we believe our identity is fundamentally good. That I think we can do it all the time. If we believe that we are flawed, broken, sinful people and we project that identity onto our leaders, that's actually a healthy thing, because it means we're going to be appropriately skeptical of their power. But if you believe we are inherently good and virtuous people and we project that onto our leaders, that's naive, and we're going to be in trouble.
Right. And that hadn't occurred to me, but I found that fascinating. And learning more about Andrew Jackson, who was, kind of the first populist president, maybe the first demagogic president. And his definition of a demagogue is someone who is building a mass that the founders were worried about, a potential demagogic leader. That would be someone who is building a mass following, but is largely unprincipled themselves. So the ability to have someone come on the scene who lacks principles, but can build a huge following by saying, the elites, the whoever it is, the corporations, we have an enemy that's out to get you, and I alone can solve the problem.
Yeah. Donald Trump is the textbook epitome of what the founders feared.
Yeah. And then suddenly we don't worry about the concentration of power that we're voting for, because we're sure that someone, quote unquote, like us will use that power justly. Christian?
And as I recall, early on in his presidency, Trump really identified himself with Jackson. I think he even quoted him a few times and really seemed to like him and feel like he was like him.
Yeah, he hung Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office.
I find that fascinating.
Well, that seems to be an indicator of some sort of affinity. Okay, so I've got a couple of stories. One of these, actually maybe both of these, I had already grabbed before I listened to that interview with Mr. McKenzie. One is a study. A study provides first evidence of a causal link between perceived moral division and support for authoritarian leaders. So this very much fits into the same thing, but it's a slightly different spin. New research indicates that heightened perceptions of moral division intensify support for strong leaders, and that the perceived breakdown of society plays a key role in this relationship. This was a study that was done in Australia, and they studied individuals in the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. So this is bigger than just, hey, what are white Americans up to? The study author says, increasingly, we're seeing societal divisions play out on moral grounds. When our moral convictions clash, things can become pretty toxic. So he wanted to know what happens to societies who perceive they are in an existential fight for their moral futures. They studied more than 1,000 people in 3 countries. But participants were asked the extent to which they believe there was an overlap in core moral values between the 2 major political parties. So in each of these countries, they said, all right, you got the 2 major parties in our country, Republicans and Democrats. How much moral overlap is there? How much do they value the same things? And when they collected that, they assessed it also assess the idea that how much do you have the perception that social systems have begun to fall apart in your country? The systems you used to rely on, how much do you perceive those as having fall apart? And those who believe the moral values of the two parties were vastly different from each other were more likely to agree with statements such as politicians don't care about the problems of the average person, and statements like people do not know who they can trust and rely on, which in turn was associated with support for leaders who are, quote, willing to break the rules and challenge the elites and wealthy corporations. So the more you think there's a huge gap in values between the two sides, the more you think that the systems you could rely on are breaking down, the more you want somebody to come in who breaks the rules of normal behavior.
Okay. I mean, not to throw shade on this research, but
stop
duh. Like, we've known this since the prequels with Emperor Palpatine. Like,
yeah, I don't know why you can't just watch Star Wars and say, yeah, obviously.
Well, and everyone knows I hate those movies, but even George Lucas got something right. He studied history. He knew this is how Hitler rose to power. This is how demagogues always rise to power. It's how authoritarians seize control. The society is perceived to break down. There's barbarians at the gate, and you hire a strong man who's going to protect you.
And somewhere along the line, Jar Jar Binks casts the deciding vote that tips you towards authoritarianism.
Yeah, and I think you could make a case that the American Congress is full of Jar Jar Binks right now.
No argument from me.
But here's the fun part of it. Here's the fun part of the story. To test for causality, because you could say, oh, sure, there's a correlation there, sure. But can you test that one is causing the other? The researchers conducted a second study with 400 U.S. participants using an experimental design that manipulated perceived moral polarization. Can I manipulate your perceived moral polarization? Participants were asked to imagine they were a citizen of a fictional society called Orinthia. The legend of Orinthia. I'm the Prince of Orinthia, which was dominated by two political parties. They were then randomly assigned to watch one of two videos about the political situation in Orinthia. One video demonstrated substantial moral and ideological consensus. The other video demonstrated the opposite, a highly polarized condition. The researchers found that participants in the high polarization condition reported an increased need for a strong leader in Orinthia. And they elected the Orinthian Trump, who then took over Orinthia, and now it's a hellhole in Middle Earth.
It's a little bit like no duh. Like,
go
ahead, Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that speaks to our human nature. I think, God created, look, Skye, I'm only quoting you now. I mean, God created order in the world. If we believe, that God exists, we believe that God created order in the world. So we crave that order. We also crave that leadership because we're made as spiritual beings. And so we are going to want order. And, we're also going to want something to worship and follow. So, no, yeah, I'm with you, Skye. No duh.
Yeah, it's just intuitive. I mean, forget totalitarianism and politics. If you were to get two groups of people and give them a hypothetical of, here's a healthy person who's completely functional and all their faculties work, and here's a malnourished person whose entire health is breaking down, which one needs a doctor? They're going to go, well, obviously the sick one needs a doctor. And likewise, in a society where everything's breaking down and nothing's functioning properly, you're going to go, oh, yeah, you need a strong man, you need a dominant leader to come in and fix this mess. And so yes, broken societies are more susceptible to totalitarian leadership, and people will welcome it because, as Christian put, we want order. And when that breaks down, we will sacrifice freedoms in order to get it.
Okay, but here's the last point that the author... Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. Didn't in our situation, and maybe even in Jackson's, didn't this totalitarian leader, however, create the brokenness and the chaos?
The perception of it. Yeah, there's a chicken and egg thing going on here.
Now you're getting to the rest of the study and the conclusions of the author. Broadly speaking, the author says, we actually tend to agree on more than we realize, and it is the perception that our society is divided that presents more of a threat than the actual divisions that do exist. Our perceptions about society becoming increasingly divided and that the moral fabric of society is collapsing are more the realistic threats to social cohesion and political stability. As such, we need to be particularly wary of people who play into these narratives for their own gain. So their conclusion is the risk to our society is not actually that we don't always agree with each other, because we've never always agreed with each other, but we actually agree with each other more than we think. The risk to our society is people without principles who play upon the perceived division.
I would add something to that. That's absolutely true. But what I would add to that is it's not just people who play into that division, it's algorithms that accentuate that
Oh,
division. Did you guys see The Social Dilemma,
Yeah,
yes,
so
Solace
that
true.
documentary?
Dilemma. Yeah, and they turned that poor kid into a radical, and he ended up getting
Yeah.
arrested by the police.
And I forgot which executive it was. They were interviewing some former tech executive, and they asked him, if we don't change this dynamic, these algorithms that drive us deeper and deeper into fringe divisions, where does it end? And he paused for a beat and he said, civil war.
Yeah.
So unlike the actual historic civil war in the 19th century, where there were deep ideological divisions in this country, the ideological divisions are artificially being created right now and accentuated by our technology because it makes more money to keep people addicted and engaged to social media. And it sends you down that rabbit hole of content where you begin to think everyone who doesn't think like you is a monster. So yeah, this is what's crazy. It's not that we're that divided. It's that people are profiting off of accentuating the divisions. And that's true
Right.
on cable news. It's true in our politics, and it's definitely true on social media.
But I think more worrying to me, and this is partly because I grew up inside, the conservative church, is how often we paint conflicts in, evil, good and evil struggle, existential battle, and that's been in my whole lifetime, whether it was the onslaught of feminism or the sexual revolution or abortion or euthanasia or whatever the issue is of the day. It's never we not never but seldom painted as disagreement between reasonable parties. It's always painted as, do you want your country to turn from God and turn towards Satan or not? And once you put it on those terms, you just, we need to be saved from Satan. So this is, we're in an existential threat, in an existential situation, and we need to take drastic measures. So it almost seems like I don't know if it's the theology of the waters that we're swimming in, or just the cultural application of biblical morality, that we just prime ourselves to freak out whenever there's a difference of position.
Christian, you were going to say something?
No, I mean, what I was thinking about when you were talking before, and Phil, I don't want to gloss over your point because I think it's very valid. But what I was thinking about is not only are those divisions flamed, but it's also our fear. So I think there's a strong connection between, someone playing to, the political differences and also stoking the fires of fear. And I've read Skye enough to know, that we really are driven by what our fears are, and, that we are looking to some sort of solution to calm that. And so if a leader stands up and makes us afraid of the other enough, we're going to follow them if they tell us they alone can save it. And you're right, Phil.
Yeah.
I heard the same thing about it's always the devil that's trying to do those things. It's this battle, cosmic battle between good and evil. And if we don't follow what this leader says or does, then really clearly the enemy is going to take over and turn this into a terrible society.
To that end, I think one of the missing components here, at least when it comes to the American context, is capitalism. If you have a product to sell, the best product to sell is one that's actually chemically addictive, like nicotine, cigarettes, things like that, because then you have
Yes.
a locked-in customer base once they try it once. But let's assume your product is not actually chemically addictive. Then the next best way to motivate people to be strongly committed to your product is by terrifying them and presenting your product as the solution to their terror. And so you tap into, what do they fear the most? A lot of Christianity in America taps into our fear for our children, right? Well, my gosh, if they listen to rock and roll music, they're going to be, handing them over to Satan or whatever the boogeyman might be at the moment. And if you then present yourself or your ministry or your product or your book or your seminar as the answer, or your political candidate as the answer to that fear, that's an incredibly powerful motivator. And I mean, why wouldn't religion in a free market economy like ours tap into exactly that low-hanging fruit? It's right there.
I got to tell you, when we were launching Veggie Tales, it was so hard to resist the urge to play into that. To say, look what Hollywood wants to do to your kids. Look at these big media companies with their unchristian attitudes. Is this what you want? No, you want these cute little Jesus vegetables. We'll keep your children safe. It was so tempting to play that card because it's so stinking effective. And sometimes I resisted and sometimes I did not. I have to save it. Let me save your children from the evil. And you there's such a ready market for that because we've just been conditioned. I find it interesting because as Christians, we're more likely to look at the world in terms of good and evil, of sin, of righteousness and unrighteousness. And I was trying to think, there's a different way that if you're coming from either a secular or just an extremely progressive perspective, it's less about those people are evil and more about their turning back the clock. They want to go back to a where women had no rights. It's more authoritarian, I guess. But it's still you still have two sides looking at the other side and saying there is no value to any argument they could make because they are fundamentally bad people, bad actors. And if it's on the left, it could be the case of they don't care about women's rights, or they don't care about kids that don't have access to health care. And on the right, it's they're doing the work of Satan, or they are ruining America. So we're both being apocalyptic from both sides. And the more you act that way, the less you can ever sit down at a booth at Denny's and actually talk it out.
Yeah. And I think you're underselling the power of this on the left as well. And there are a lot of dynamics in secular progressive America that look a lot like the hallmarks or the fingerprints of religious fanaticism. And you're seeing it around things like global warming. And there's mission there, and there's purpose, and there's apocalyptic rhetoric, and there's a sense of those who are not helping us are actually naively immoral on the side.
There is a immorality in that regard.
So it exists on both sides, and it's getting more and more extreme, which is why it's so hard for us to cooperate anymore, to get anything done. It's why every presidential election is an existential threat to one side or the other, because we no longer have a functional Congress that negotiates and compromises. And it's just not sustainable. We cannot continue the American experiment without a large middle that's willing to work together.
Right.
And it makes me wonder how long before it cracks, before it breaks beyond repair.
So last week, David French wrote a piece that said, go ahead, Christian.
No. I mean, I was just going to say, I think as Christians, this show exists. Most of our listeners are Christians, or they're seeking out curiosity. There is a solution for this situation, but it resides within us individually. And I think first acknowledging that this problem exists, and this is the way outside people are trying to divide us or stoke our fears or whatever, we can certainly be wise to that, that, we're trying to be manipulated that way. But I think ultimately, and I tend to come back to this a lot, ultimately our ability to stay centered and not be led into rabbit trails, whether they're on the left or the right, is to find our identity, to find, the solution in the scriptures that we read in the Bible, and in nurturing that relationship with Christ, who is ultimately the one that calms our fears and provides us a clear direction. And I think he's really the only one that can stem the tides of anything evil that's going to happen to us. But even so, evil may happen. The question is, are we seeking good? Are we seeking safety? Are we seeking to be delivered? Is that our goal and our God? Or are we going to walk with God, come what may? And I think, ultimately that's what's going to help us in the midst of a time like this.
Amen.
Right. I also remember in the movie Chariots of Fire when Eric Liddell was criticized by a member of the British Olympic Committee for putting God before king and country. In my day, we put king and country first. And I think we kind of do that sometimes, that we're more concerned about America than we are about the way of Jesus, and will sacrifice the way of Jesus to save America, as Jerry, it was Donald Trump Jr. who said, we've been turning the other cheek and doing this Jesus thing for a while, and what has it gotten us? What has it gotten us? Let's be honest. This isn't working. If what we want is power, if what we want is our perception of cultural preservation, man, doing the Jesus thing just doesn't seem to be a very effective way to get what we really want, which of course isn't Jesus. It's cultural.
It's power.
Dominance. Okay. Yeah, it is. David French wrote a piece last week. The seeds of political violence are being sown in church. He was criticized for that because he's always criticizing the white church. And some people are really sick of it and they want him to knock it off and, either say nice things. Hey, this week in church news, some flowers were planted by the First Baptist Church of Franklin, Tennessee. Oh, thank you. That's fascinating. So, but his piece was an opinion piece, and I didn't want to jump into that because you can just say, well, that's his opinion. But I wanted to jump into a study that's on a very similar frame of what are Christians becoming pro-violence? Is that the problem that's happening in terms of political violence? Victimhood, racial identity, and conspiracism are interacting with Christian nationalism to lead to a support for violence. There's been some studies that have shown a disturbing number of conservative Christians think that political violence may be necessary in America to achieve the outcomes that we want. And so this was a group that actually did a study to say, okay, what makes one prone to political violence? Is it Christianity? Is it evangelical Christianity? Is it Pentecostalism, which is something that David French almost hinted at a little bit, but said he knows lots of Pentecostals that aren't into violence? I know a lot of Pentecostals that aren't violent, so that's good.
Part of it, though, is Pentecostalism of the traditions you've mentioned. It is historically much more of a populist movement.
Yeah.
And so that can lend itself then to being persuaded by a demagogic kind of leader and even violence. It doesn't mean Pentecostalism is violent. It just means the personality type drawn to it could be drawn to the same thing.
This was a study done by at the University of Mississippi and the University of Louisville. Said many signs pointed to Christianity playing a role in the January 6th uprising, but existing evidence suggests that mere Christianity, the book did not play a role, that mere Christianity or even evangelicalism is an incomplete explanation for the support for violence. Rather, an ideology that blends Christian supremacy specifically with American identity, which they call Christian nationalism, was more likely at the heart of violence and support thereof. So the researchers found that support for Christian nationalism was positively associated with increased support for political violence. But the link between Christian nationalism and political violence, they also found that not all people that would qualify as Christian nationalists support violence. So it's not that simple either. The link between Christian nationalism and political violence appeared to be conditioned by three things. Are you ready, Christian?
This is
are you
the
ready?
Secret sauce, the recipe?
This is the secret sauce. If if they asked questions to identify these 3 additional factors, they could very accurately predict if they were talking with a Christian who would support political violence. White identity, perceived victimhood, and support for QAnon or other conspiracies. Christian nationalism was linked to political violence primarily among those who strongly supported QAnon and agreed with statements such as, "It is important that whites work together to change laws that are unfair to whites," and "The world is out to get me."
So, in other words, racism, anger, and stupidity. That combination will usually lead to somebody supporting political violence.
Well, not to put
Now, are you
too fine
using
a point on
stupidity
it,
in the
Skye.
sense that that Bonhoeffer used stupidity in a very respectful and theological sense?
No.
Oh. So they wanted to say this, and I appreciate them saying this as a conclusion from this study. Most individuals do not support violence. Okay, so that's good. So we start there. Nor do most Christians, regardless of denomination. Okay, so we got that. Most Christians do not support violence. Yay!
That's good.
Yay for us. Rather, those who adhere most strongly to a very specific variant of Christian supremacy are the most likely to support violence. But other characteristics like perceived victimhood, strong white identity, and conspiratorial thinking exacerbate the link between Christian nationalism and support for violence. So you need to start with someone who says, "Hey, y'all, America was supposed to be Christian." That's what it started as. It started Christian. It was supposed to be Christian. We should keep it Christian. Then if you add on to that, and white people are really getting the short end of the stick. And I feel like the world is out to get me. And I'm not done, Skye. I'm not done, Skye. And did you hear about what's going on in the basement of that pizza parlor? That's shocking. Put all those things together in a pot, and you have someone at the Capitol spraying bear spray at a police officer.
Okay, hasn't this always been the case, though?
What?
Like, I'm thinking back to, again, the 19th century and even the years leading up to the Civil War. You saw that same combination of things. White supremacy, clearly a huge factor in the South prior to the Civil War. Secondly, the tight intertwining of that white identity and that supremacy with Christian faith as a means of justifying it, that this isn't just white supremacy, this is how God wants the world and intends the world to operate.
Right.
There's a victimhood, those Northerners, those Yankees, and Abraham Lincoln, they're out to get us. And there was a lot of conspiracy thinking going on that led to stirring up of the South to rebel against the North. So I wonder if I'd love to see studies that determine, does this transcend generation and culture even? Can you go to a totally different place like Brazil and find very similar traits that would lead people to endorse political violence, or South Asia, or wherever you want to try it? Or is this a unique recipe for the American experience that leads to political violence?
Well, you can look at the Middle East. I mean, and lots of other places in the world where there are similar issues at play. So it's not just us.
Political violence certainly isn't unique to our context, and it's, maybe surprisingly rare in our context. But the fact that it's coming so visibly from people who are carrying Jesus flags, does give one pause.
That's the part I don't understand. Why do we call it political violence when it's white Christian people in America, but we call it religious violence when it's Muslim terrorists in the Middle East?
That's a very good question.
Jason, what do you got? You want to take that one?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Skye. I think it's just that it's us, right? It's the dominant culture, and so that's why we're just like, oh well, it's fine.
Yes,
it's fine.
Yes,
yeah.
It's us trying to fix things. It's not terrorism if you're trying to fix things.
Right.
It's terrorism if you're trying to break things. And because America was generally pro-Zionist, the Balfour Declaration and the founding of modern Israel were fixing things.
What exactly were they fixing on January 6th when they were smearing poop all over the walls of the Capitol?
They were fixing. Well, I wasn't doing news of the butt because the Valentine's Day, Skye, thank you very much. And I had one, but I've set it aside. But now you've driven us right into butt news. They were fixing the broken election system that robbed their chosen candidate, and I think we can all say Jesus' preferred candidate, from his rightful place in making us great again. So I had to smear poop on your institution.
I just love the fact that their form of protest is the same thing that the monkeys do at the zoo when they're angry at the that's the level of political discourse that we have come to in this country. We're just flinging poop at each other.
Yes, on your institution. Christian, help us out.
Well, no, I had a question, and I apologize in advance if this is very simple and, knuckle-headed, and I should already know this. But maybe there's one other person out there wondering about this as well. So I'm going to be brave and go ahead and ask you. But, when I think about, thank you. When I think about the Christian crosses that I saw at the January 6th insurrection, and I hear how Christians are charging forth with the banner of Christ, standing against all evil and tyranny, it does make me wonder if we're just taking a page out of the book of the Crusades. They did the same thing. We are Christians, and we're going to, I think we're going to take back this land for Christ and make everybody Christians, and we're going to slaughter everybody to do that. And we're going to do it in the name of Jesus.
Yeah, the slaughtering wasn't really part of the original plan, but emotions got high in the course of the Crusades, and the slaughtering commenced. But yeah, the First Crusade was justified under the guise of love of neighbor, and the neighbor was your Christian brother and sister in the Holy Land who is living under Islamic rule. And if you love your neighbor like Christ loves you, you're willing to give up your life for your neighbor, which means you're going to take up arms against the Muslim occupiers of Palestine. And, and then when you really get going with that, you just start killing people left and right. So hopefully that's not where we are. The Canadians are sort of getting in on it because they're, the capital of Canada is completely shut down by truckers. And a lot of evangelical Christians are popping up in the protests. And because the GoFundMe website was shut down, so Americans couldn't funnel money to the protesters that way, they're instead using the most popular Christian crowdfunding site to get money up to the freedom fighters of Canada. And
which is what?
Some of the Canadian journalists are trying to figure. Which is what?
Which is what Christian?
What's the Christian funding?
Yeah.
Oh, the Christian crowdfunding site is called
Give, Send, Go?
Go, give, give, send, go, give, go, send, now, go.
Something, yeah.
I don't have it right in front of me. But
.net.
It's a Christian crowdfunding site. It's also the one that raised the most money for that poor kid in Kenosha that shot people to protect somebody's car dealership. Give, Send, Go. Give, Send, Go is the American Christian fundraiser. So yeah, it's now the biggest American funder of the what's going on in Canada, which is making them say, do we have a problem with our evangelicals too? We were hoping that was just an American thing.
I have to confess, I have not followed the Canadian trucker protests super closely. But am I correct that this was primarily about vaccine mandates?
Yes. It's freedom. That's primarily about freedom, Skye. Freedom from tyranny.
And what
expressed as vaccine mandates.
What are these Canadian truckers not able to do if they're not vaccinated?
Oh, they can't. They have to quarantine after a trip to the U.S. So if you're a long haul trucker and you're driving between Canada and the U.S. and you're not vaccinated, you can drive to the U.S., but when you get back, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks, which really messes up your ability to make money. So,
Well,
that's the thing.
don't truckers typically drive alone anyway? Like, how
I don't know
difficult
if
is quarantining for a trucker?
I don't know if you can quarantine in your truck while you're doing your job. Because you have to talk to people. You have to go into.
They have CB radios.
You have to go into truck stops. You have to go to the bathroom. You have to take a shower.
They pee in milk jugs, and they,
Guy,
it's the trucker
All
lifestyle.
right, all
Guy, you
right,
are
all
really-
right. We
you
gotta
are really taking us on a side.
No.
Yeah.
I don't mean that disparagingly. Like, I've actually
Mm-hmm.
fantasized about being a cross-country trucker before because it seems like the perfect job for an introvert.
Okay. Can we talk about this later, maybe, Skye? I'm just not sure that this is exactly, you could do some research on your own and learn about the cranky Canadian truckers.
Yeah. I need to know what the heart of this matter was
Yeah.
and why they hate
Freedom,
Justin Trudeau
Skye.
so much.
It's freedom, Skye. Well, because he was fairly strict with lockdowns and measures, and a lot of people are mad about that. And Canada does have some of America's sort of Wild West libertarianism in it because it has a West that was wild, and and they watch a lot of American TV. So
And we set
There
such
you
a
go.
good example for those Canadians,
yeah. So we got to wrap this up because we got to go. We got places to go and things to do, important stuff happening. I got to go get in my big wheeler and go block downtown Wheaton, so none of the Wheaton College kids can get to their coffee shop, and that'll bring freedom. Anyway, I think we have to be extremely careful as Christians when we paint a conflict or a disagreement as good versus evil, as my side is Jesus and that side is Satan. There may be cases where that may be true-ish, but let's default thinking it's not accurate and that both sides are actually reasonable people with arguments worth listening to. And then we're less likely to listen to leaders who want to demonize the other side to create unrest to get power. And we can make the country actually better, or maybe even the world.
And isn't it a little bit of the boy who cried wolf thing, where if everything is this, eschatological crisis between good and evil, then when a real crisis does arise, you've kind of spent you got no credibility anymore.
Right. We're losing credibility, people. We're losing credibility. So let's calm the heck down. Even if you strongly disagree with someone, they might have some interesting points that are worth listening to. I'm almost positive that they might be worth listening to. And be careful who's, if you're a leader in particular, be careful who is discipling your flock. Because if it isn't you, it's someone. And
if it isn't you, they're not your flock.
Oh, that's true. I didn't think about that. Wow. Okay. Patreon supporters, thank you so much for your support. You help us pay the bills so we can keep doing this because we're having so much fun. We're building an audience of people who are trying to stay sane in a world that's gone mad, and we appreciate your support. And we got a great interview coming up, so stay around, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
The Holy Post is brought to you by our listeners who support us on Patreon. This episode is also sponsored by our friends at Faithful Counseling. We can all agree the last couple of years have been nuts. Sure, you can unload all your troubles on your best friend, or your cat, or that David Hasselhoff poster on your wall, but what if you could talk to a trained professional? Nothing against your cat or David Hasselhoff, but Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states. And you don't have to go into an office. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions. Plus, you can chat and text with your therapist. With expertise in depression, stress, anxiety, trauma, family conflicts, and more. Not happy with your counselor? Ask for a new one at any time. Financial aid is available for those who qualify. Plus, Holy Post listeners get 10% off your first month from our sponsor, Faithful Counseling. What have you got to lose? Give it a try. Go to faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Just fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs, and you'll get matched with a counselor you'll love. That's faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And now, back to the show.
Last year, the Barna Group came out with research that said 38% of pastors were seriously considering leaving ministry in the last year. That raises a ton of questions, and not just about the stress of the pandemic, but what's really going on with our pastors, our churches, and even the way we conceive of ministry. My guest today is my friend Glenn Packiam. He wears many hats, but one of them is that he's a senior fellow at Barna. And his new book, The Resilient Pastor, Leading Your Church in a Rapidly Changing World, takes tons of new data from Barna, combines it with input from pastors and experts from around the world, and investigates what's really going on in the souls of pastors and why are so many of them ready to throw in the towel. Glenn Packiam has some real wisdom and insight drawn from his own experience as a pastor and from these conversations he had with many others around the world. Glenn Packiam is the Associate Senior Pastor at New Life Church in Colorado Springs and the lead pastor of one of its 8 congregations, New Life Downtown. Apart from wearing that hat, as well as his role at Barna, he is also a fellow at St. John's College at Durham University and an adjunct professor at Denver Seminary. He's written a number of books. We had him on the show before to talk about his book, Blessed, Broken, Given, which is just fantastic. And I was delighted to have him back to talk about this really important topic that doesn't just frankly impact pastors, but all of us who are part of the church. Here's my conversation with Glenn Packiam. Glenn Packiam, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Always good to talk to you, Skye. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime. I love talking to you too. This new book is fantastic. The Resilient Pastor, Leading Your Church in a Rapidly Changing World. You did this in cooperation with Barna. The book is saturated with statistics that you kind of hold our hand through and guide us through and introduce tons of other voices and perspectives on it. Let me start with the most basic, but perhaps the most important question. What is a pastor?
I love that question, Skye, because you're right. It seems basic, but it is the most important question. And if we get this wrong, then we're off on the wrong foot. I mean, a pastor literally is a shepherd. She or he is an under shepherd to Jesus, the great shepherd, the good shepherd. And we're tasked with the care of God's flock. But I would pair that with this phrase that Eugene Peterson used to use all the time, that a pastor is one who pays attention and calls attention to God's work. And I love that because there's several things in there that matter. First of all, it's God's work. And it's God that's responsible for his church. It's God that has formed this church and is leading his church. But secondly, the pastor is not unique in that we're the only one who sees the work of God. No, but we're supposed to sort of pay attention to it. And then we call attention to it. We're inviting people to join God in his work. Like, Skye, you're with God devotional. I mean, you're the king of sort of helping us understand we're not doing this work for, but rather with, and pastors are supposed to join God and then invite others to join God as well.
So one of the selling points of this book, to be crass about it, is data that Barna's come out with recently that says a shocking number of pastors are thinking about leaving their role. Was it about 36%, 38%?
38%. Yeah. So in January of 2021, they asked the question, have you seriously considered quitting full-time ministry? And that was 29%. And then in October of 2021, they asked again, and it was 38%. So that is a bit concerning.
Yeah. And hence the title of the book, The Resilient Pastor. How do people in pastoral ministry stay with it for the long haul? What does it take? But one of the challenges you have very early in the book is some of this is autobiographical. You are sharing about your own journey and struggle with what does it mean to be a pastor in your context. So we'll get into that in a minute. And you've already mentioned Eugene Peterson and his definition of a pastor, but you have this lengthy quote from him early in the book. Where am I? Page 47. I want to read this because it's so classically Peterson and it's shocking and true at the same time. Here's what he said. American pastors are abandoning their posts left and right at an alarming rate. They are not leaving their churches and getting other jobs. Congregations still pay their salaries. Their names remain on the church stationery, and they continue to appear in pulpits on Sundays. But they are abandoning their posts, their calling. They have gone whoring after other gods. Okay.
Man,
what did he mean by that? And here's why I'm bringing it up, because when you hear about so many pastors thinking about leaving the ministry over the last couple of years, you can go, oh yeah, it's gotten a lot harder and things are tough and the culture's changing and the pandemic and the cultural divisions and the political crap that's going on. And yet here's Peterson, this predates the pandemic, obviously, saying actually part of the responsibility is on pastors themselves.
Yes.
So what is he getting at here?
Well, with that stat, the Barna thing that we referenced, there's two ways of taking that. First of all, I do want to say to some pastors who are leaving the office of pastor, you're not leaving the calling of pastor. You might be changing the occupation that. So I want to be careful not to shame a person who's trying to steward their calling, but live out their calling in a different container, as it were, in a different context. So that's on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have what Eugene is saying, which is you haven't actually changed. You haven't left the office of the pastor, but you have left the calling. And what Peterson was referring to was these gods of sort of consumerism, or kind of viewing congregants as customers, and how do we get more of them? And man, Skye, if that isn't the plague on the American church, I mean, that's exactly the way that we sort of desecrate our own vocation, is by only thinking about these metrics of attendance and giving and all of this stuff. And that's a way of living, abandoning our vocation while staying in our jobs.
So share a little bit of your own journey. You took a pilgrimage to visit Eugene Peterson. Explain what prompted that and what you came away with.
Well, I am at a church in Colorado Springs that I've been at for almost 22 years. And 6 years into my time at the church, the founding senior pastor, a guy named Ted Haggard, a name that maybe would be familiar to those who are up on evangelical sort of news and all that, he had a pretty public moral failure. And it was an earthquake sort of moment for me. I was in my young 20s at the time, and it made me question, what really is a pastor? What really are we trying to do here at the local church? And Skye, I grew up in Malaysia. My parents were pastors. My dad and my parents were great pastors. They cared for people. They were, had people in their homes, and so I was sort of contrasting the life of the pastorate that I had grown up watching, and then kind of this other view of it that I had witnessed at New Life. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to trash, sort of large church or that sort of thing, because there's ways of doing that with a kind of holiness. But that's what I was wrestling with, was, do I need to leave this context in order to live out my vocation with the kind of what Eugene called vocational holiness? And so I began reading The Contemplative Pastor, Working the Angles, Under the Unpredictable Plant, all these books that Eugene had written about the pastoral calling. And it was messing with me. I mean, I thought, I can't do this. A pastoral work is personal and local, and I can't do this here. And
but hold on, before you go on, because many of us who've been pastors have read those books and are deeply influenced by them. How did what you were reading in his books contradict what you were experiencing at New Life? It's not just New Life, but what was it about the way the American evangelical model of church didn't fit what you were reading about the pastoral calling?
Well, I mean, he really bucks against sort of the reporting of numbers and attendance and that kind of stuff. Not that we shouldn't do that, but there's a famous story, and fans of Peterson will know this. There's a famous story where he started filling in these reports with like salacious events that were not true, that about him having affairs and putting mushrooms in the communion and all this stuff. And nobody called him, which was his point, that they only read page 1, which was, kind of giving an attendance. They never read page 2. So it was stuff like that. It was the way he talked about the pace of ministry, the attentiveness that we had to individuals, to people, to take another person's story with holiness and seriousness. Those were things that were making me squirm, and so I wanted to know, gosh, is this context for church? Is it just, it's impossible to kind of live out this way. So I wrote to him. And he was very gracious, and he said, okay, you can come. And so I went with a friend of mine, and we spent a couple days in their home. And the beautiful thing, Skye, was at the end of it, what I learned from Eugene was that there is no perfect context in which to be a pastor. There's no ideal scenario. He didn't love necessarily his denominational context. It wasn't like he had 100% alignment. His mother, we know this now from his biography, was a Pentecostal preacher. So there are other parts of who he was as a person and as a pastor that weren't exactly congruent with his context. So it knocked some of my young or youthful idealism off a little bit, that said, okay, I've got to go plant a church because then I can create the ideal context.
Right.
And what Eugene said to me is, he said, if you have a little space within this church that you're in where you can be a pastor to this group of people. And at the time I was leading a Sunday night service with a couple hundred people. And I thought, yeah, I do have that. And he said, if you have that, then you can live this out where you are. And that was such a source of encouragement to me.
Not to kind of poop on the sense of encouragement at all, but Because I wrestled with this. We're about the same
Yeah.
age. I was hired by my first church to do a Sunday night service with a small
Uh-huh.
group of people. Like, there's a lot of resonance here.
Yeah.
And over time, I felt some of the tension as well, though my church was not a mega church. But when your title is pastor,
Yeah.
and you're looking at your week, and you realize, people who aren't watching this, I'm holding up my hand, showing like about a 2-inch amount of space here, and you're looking at your schedule, and you realize, well, for this little bit of my week, I get to actually pastor.
Yeah.
But the majority of my week, I am not functioning as a pastor. I'm functioning as an administrator, or, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
I mean, at what point do you go, this is just bad stewardship of my time?
Yeah.
You mentioned some people who are leaving the role of pastor, but not the vocation or the calling of pastor. Um, is that part of what's leading to this sense of burnout and exhaustion? Is that so many people who genuinely are called to be pastors are in systems that don't let them be pastors?
That's exactly right, Skye. So in writing this book, one of the things that I did was I mapped out sort of these 8 challenges, and then I combed through existing Barna research, and then I got to work with their team to design kind of a new, study of pastors. But then I also did a focus group. Actually, I did 3 focus groups with pastors in the US, Canada, and the UK, because I wanted more than like responses and statistics. Nothing wrong with that, but I wanted some stories. And absolutely, this is borne out by both the stats and the stories. Pastors said, look, what I'm doing is not what I thought I was going to be doing. And it's not really what I was prepared or trained to do. And it's not really what I love to do. So Eugene does this analogy of the triangle, and he says, the obvious, or kind of the most prominent parts of a triangle are its straight lines. And he's like, that's kind of like the pastoral office, preaching, teaching, and administration. Now, you can't get out of it. Those lines are there. But what gives it its shape are these angles. And this is the book, Working the Angles, where he says the angles are prayer, study, and spiritual direction. And so I think for me, it was not a matter of eliminating administration, but it was to say, is the tail wagging the dog here? Like, am I being proactive about how I make my week to where I can have time for prayer, have time for spiritual direction, have time for study, and all of that?
Yeah. Okay. I want to spend some time on this, camp on this for a little bit, because this is part of the book that I found both encouraging and really challenging. You do dig into where are pastors spending their time. What do they feel equipped to do? What do they not feel equipped to do? Let me dig into some of the stats.
Yeah.
So only 8% said that they felt seminary prepared them well for effective church leadership. Okay. And when you drill down into where did they not find preparation in seminary,
Mm-hmm.
key areas were counseling burdens and solving people's problems, administrative burdens, and handling conflict.
Yeah.
So that's where they weren't trained well. I would concur. Like, I don't think I spent nearly enough time in seminary on those topics, given how much of my energy when I was a pastor went into that.
Yeah.
And you're nodding your head that
I
that's
agree.
totally true.
Yeah.
Okay. Now here's where I think things get a little weird. What do pastors think they do well? 57% think they do preaching and teaching really well or excellently.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty optimistic self-assessment, frankly. But okay, what I want to link this, so almost 60% say that they preach and teach really well, and that's what seminary trained them to do.
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
also, yes, that's what seminary trains you to do.
Yep.
Okay, last thing, and then I want to get your feedback on this. When you looked at where they actually spent their time, 15 hours a week on average in sermon prep, and 6.5 hours leading services and events. So, assuming a 40 to 45 hour work week, pastors are spending more than 50% of their time just on the preaching act or event.
Yeah.
And yet, I having been a preacher, and I know you're a preacher, like, this is the part that I just can't get my mind around. Seminary trains us to preach. Pastors think they're really good at preaching. They give most of their time and energy to preaching and the preaching event. And yet, can you really make the case that that's what most of our people need more of? So, and what I'm arguing here is, have we designed pastoral ministry around what pastors want to do rather than what the sheep actually need?
It's a tricky thing, Skye, because when we look at our sort of cultural moment, and especially in the North American context, yeah, I think you're onto something. Like, goodness, are we just sort of, is this a self-perpetuating system here? We're attracting people who like to talk or like to read and like to talk and teach, and on and on. But on the other hand, if we kind of pan out or zoom out and look historically, I mean, this is what we see early on in the book of Acts, where the apostles are saying, look, hang on a minute, we need to be able to devote ourselves to study and to prayer and to the teaching and preaching of the word of God. And so they did sort of, the rise of deacons, of course, is to help handle the administration of service and outreach and care. But man, that's a tricky thing, because I don't want to give up on the power of the proclaimed word of God. I think there's something really important about the way the word of God being proclaimed in the context of Christian worship. And the voices that maybe kind of come from the Hauerwas camp or whatever, where church is, how does a church be a witness to the world? By being the church, so there is a sense in which our job, our vocation, is meant to make people scratch their heads and say, what's that about? That doesn't make any sense. And we say, yeah, the foolishness of preaching is how the people of God are formed. On the other hand, if we were just to look again at the snapshot of this moment, what's it doing? Isn't it just propping up more sort of celebrity communicators?
Mm-hmm.
And is it actually, this chapter in many ways is related to the chapter on the crisis or challenge of formation.
Yes.
Like, if formation is all about get more butts in the seats to hear the great communicator, like, excuse me, that doesn't work. And that isn't that's where we actually depart from the early church. So maybe we rightly kind of emphasize preaching, but we've missed the other components that made the early Christians so effective.
Yeah, I mean, we've created an economic model of church which is predicated on preaching, right? You have a gifted orator who hopefully is speaking truth, but not necessarily, who gets up front, that attracts a crowd. Those people come into a large room and they put money in a plate. And that's the model. And so if ultimately you want to form disciples, as you talk about later in the book, there's a lot more to it than sitting passively and listening to somebody talk.
Yeah.
But that's what pastors say they're good at. It's what they're trained to do. It's what the model is designed to do. And it's what they give most of their time to.
Yeah.
And yet, increasingly, the data is showing it's not actually forming disciples.
It's not, because it's not enough. It's not supposed to be enough. It's not
Right.
supposed to stand alone. And this is where, in the chapter on formation, I look at the kind of the movement that Dr. King led in the 50s and 60s, and then cross reference it with what Cyprian and the church was doing in Carthage with catechesis, where there is a teaching component, and
Absolutely.
we can talk later about, it's very important that they weren't just teaching sort of this transactional gospel. You and I have both spent a lot of time trying to correct that paradigm of the transactional gospel. They were teaching the cruciform life, a Christ-shaped sort of life. And it's all your stuff you've written on what if Jesus was serious, So they're teaching Jesus's teaching, and then they had practices that they would do together as a community. And there was a sort of apprenticeship that was going on there. And that's the piece, you're absolutely right, Skye. That's the piece that we miss, and that I feel the nervousness about, I feel the tension about, when you have kind of the bigger and bigger Sunday service. That's not automatically bad, but can it decenter things so that that is taking all of the resources and energy and attention to prop up or perpetuate, and you're not doing it anymore or enough to sort of say, but what about the communal practices, the apprenticeship that we're engaging in together to actually form disciples?
Yeah, to go back to Eugene Peterson's definition for a moment, pastor is somebody who's paying attention to God and helping others do the same. More stats that come out from the Barna research, 60% of pastors found it somewhat difficult or very difficult to invest time in their own spiritual development.
Yeah, isn't that something? Man.
Holy cow. Like if the primary calling of the pastor is to pay attention to God, and 60% are saying they don't have time to pay attention to God, then how are they going to be equipped to help others?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And that's why I do think, you're onto something here. We've got to help pastors sort of rescue them from a bit of this treadmill of the burden of organizational management, and help somehow for them to get time away, time alone, time to renew their own love for Jesus.
Let's talk a little bit about authority.
Yeah.
You have this page 117, this brief but helpful look through history about where did pastors find their authority at different eras in the church. Early on, you talk about medieval centuries where pastors or the priests at the time were seen as having some special anointed spiritual power, sort of a supernatural ability to connect God and people. So it was in the mysticism sort of the pastor. And then during modernity, it really came to be rooted in the pastor's education. Because they were all men basically at that point, were highly educated people, the most respected and educated people in the town. They knew how to read, they could engage in great learning, and they taught everyone else. And then you argue that in the present, an awful lot of pastors root their authority in their institutional influence. Talk a little bit about that shift from education to institution as the foundation of authority, and then we'll talk about why that's problematic as well.
Well, in the book, I referenced that a lot of this stuff comes from Andrew Root's really excellent book, A Pastor in a Secular Age. And Root is the one who kind of draws this line and connection and showing that in the kind of, 1920s, 1930s, sort of, when America was booming, you kind of saw the rise of some of these churches that were significant as social institutions. They had kind of leverage. They could kind of lean on the titans of industry, the Rockefellers or whatever, and say, shouldn't you use your money this way? Or they could lean on a mayor in a big city. There's examples that Root gives of churches in New York and all of that. But of course, we see that in the 80s and the 90s with megachurches, where all of a sudden churches become the places where presidential candidates need to pop in or do debates or forums or whatever. Even when it's done well, the fact that a church should have such sort of cultural capital, if you will, or social leverage, that's an interesting thing. I do think that the next disruption that we're all in the midst of is where it's not connected to institutional size, but digital influence. Mm-hmm. So a number of Instagram followers, podcast listeners, whatever, we now hold a kind of authority based on influence. So it's tricky, and I think each of those things have probably merit, and with any source of power, it's really about how we steward it. But I think if we lean on it and say, no, this is actually the source of my power. And for many pastors, the temptation is, therefore I have got to grow my church so then I can be better known.
Right. It's the size of your platform is the increase in your authority. Okay. You have this amazing, perfect paragraph on page 118 that this is you. You're not quoting anybody, but I'm going to quote you. You write, the source of our authority ultimately comes not from our popularity or influence, though without influence, one could hardly be a leader, not from our education, though training and preparation are good things, and not from the institutions we lead, though creating institutions is part of having presence in place. The source of our authority is Jesus, and it comes from being in his presence. Okay. Amen. Could not agree more. And yet 60% of pastors are saying they don't have time to engage in their own spiritual formation, in their own time and presence with Jesus. So we have kind of a perfect storm going on here, don't we? Where pastors in their busyness in maintaining their platforms are not developing their own spiritual authority and gravity and communion with God. And then they're basing authority on something other than Jesus. Like, are you at all surprised that we're in the mess we're in, given the stats that you've spent probably a year writing about?
No, it's not surprising, Skye, but it is sobering, and it's the kind of thing where, this sort of system, if you will, is perfectly designed to get the results it's getting, right? So as long as we continue to prioritize platform and all of that stuff, then we're gonna encourage, we're gonna incentivize pastors to invest all of their time and energy to increasing that, and not the discipleship of the church that they've been entrusted with, and maybe more crucially, our own sort of spiritual formation and our own kind of time with God. And that's the tragedy of all of this. Is in the end, it's like killing the goose that lays the golden egg. The only way we have something to give as pastors is if we are with Jesus. And it sounds like such the Sunday school answer kind of thing, but in the Gospels, it's so clear. Jesus called the 12 and he called them to himself. It says he called them to be with him. And it may be that we've just forgotten the basic things about all of this, that we didn't sign up for ministry to be famous or to have large churches or to hit the conference circuit. We signed up for this because we love Jesus, and Jesus was calling us to this. But somewhere along the way, not only did our schedules make it difficult, but maybe our own vanity made it difficult.
So you're reminding me of a story. I may have told this in the past on the show. When I was still a young pastor and I was working part-time with Christianity Today, Leadership Journal, I went to, I think it was called the National Pastors Conference or the National Pastors Convention, something like it was in San Diego. Did you ever go to that?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, it was put on by the publishers, a big hubbub about it. And I was just there as an attender to report on it for CT. And one afternoon, Marshall Shelley and I, who was my boss, were walking through this mega, hotel ballroom breakout session corridor where there's all these rooms where different, somewhat well-known pastors were doing breakout sessions. And this is probably 2005, maybe. And the ones you would expect were there. I think Mark Driscoll was doing one. Rob Bell may have been there. Like all these young, people with tattoos and torn jeans and really cool whatevers. And so we were popping our heads into the different breakout sessions to see which one did we want to sit in on and possibly report. And so we went from room to room to room. And then we opened up the door of one room and it was absolutely jam-packed. You couldn't, people were sitting on the floor. You need a lubricant to get another person into that room, right? It was so packed. And the person at the front who was presenting was Dallas Willard.
Wow.
And we couldn't get in the room, so we went back into the hallway. And Marshall said to me, he said, I don't get it. Like, you have all these young, hip, cool pastors with big churches that are doing sessions, and all these young people are cramming into this room with Dallas Willard, who was the antithesis of cool, hip, relevant. I mean,
right.
I don't know, he was probably in his late 60s, early 70s at that point. The opposite of a flashy presenter, dressed like a middle-aged, older white guy. I mean, the opposite. And he was asking me as a young person there, like, why was everyone attracted to Dallas? And the best answer I could think of at the time was he just smelled like Jesus. Like he just felt like the real thing. I mean, he had the gravity of soul of somebody who had spent a lot of time with Jesus. It seems to me like one of the prescriptions you're giving to the resilient pastor throughout this book is we just have to slow down.
Yes.
So talk about what that looks like for you. I mean, you are doing a lot. You are a pastor. Mm-hmm. What have you applied from your year or more immersed in this data?
A story that I come back to over and over again in the Gospels is the one at the end of John's Gospel where Jesus is trying to renew Peter's call, and John doesn't tell the story of the first call, but other Gospels do. And the circumstances are very, there's a lot of parallels there. Couldn't catch anything. Jesus says, try again, all this stuff. But in the first time Jesus called Peter, he says, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. And you almost wonder if Peter just sort of caught the second part and, it's all started running with the purpose and the cause and all this stuff. The second time Jesus renews his call, or, in the second moment, Jesus says, do you love me? And I've thought about this story, Skye, through some of the darkest days that I've experienced as a pastor here at New Life, some of the most disorienting experiences I've had of having these profound moments of saying, let me slow down enough to this is going to sound like I'm a mystic here, and I guess I am, but to almost imagine me in that conversation with Jesus and to say, yeah, I love you. Like, I don't know if I love this church. I don't know if I love these people. I don't know if I love this cause, but I love you. And if you're still here, if you're asking me to still be here, then I'll be here. And throughout, the last couple of years for me, the pandemic, and even in the writing of this book, I have found myself out of sort of reflexively, every night putting my head on the pillow and closing my eyes, taking a deep breath, and imagining that face of Jesus again and saying, I love you, Jesus. I'm still with you, Jesus. I want to follow you. And that's a simple, maybe the mystics would call that a breath prayer. I don't know. It was just sort of reflexive for me. But I think those moments of starting our day, of ending our day, and then extended time. I mean, I realized, and Eugene said this decades ago, his schedule was out of control. He said busyness is the result of vanity or laziness. So I've learned the hard way that if I don't block out the first hours of my day, the morning time to read, to pray, to study, to think, it'll easily get taken up by all of the stuff, all of the things. So I'm not saying it's every day I have this sort of monastic beginning to the morning. No, I have 4 kids, so it's not, we don't want to have this sort of idealization of it. And yet we do have to build in these mile markers. One of the more encouraging things from my focus group was pastors who told me that they have monthly a day alone with God. And I just thought, man, that's something simple that every pastor could do. Just build it into your schedule, one Monday a month or whatever it is, one Friday a month, and 8 to 5, you're out on your own with Jesus. We need that.
Apart from your individual disciplines, then, how does that slowing down translate into the sheep? How does that translate into the way you are actually engaging your congregation?
I think I think part of the challenge is to not busy them, is to not invite them into all the stuff, all the programs, all the things. And it's a challenge because in any church, I mean, there's a sort of parallel here with physics, right? That when an object gains mass, it gains gravitational pull. And as churches grow, we're always trying, it's going to have this gravitational pull. Come to this, come to this, come to this, come to this. But I think the way churches work when they're healthy is there is a gathering and then there's a spinning out. But that spinning out is not possible unless we let their own schedules breathe. So one of the gifts actually of the last couple of years was not being able to do all that much with the church and having to say, hey, let's just do these few things, and then we're praying for one another. And so in some ways it made us recognize, you know what, maybe we can survive without all these extra midweek things that we're trying to run, these programs we're trying to run.
So is that going to be a permanent shift for you? Let's hope we're at the end of this pandemic now and things are moving more towards the new normal. Would you advise pastors to really take an inventory and decide what can go?
Yes, absolutely. And we have done that. We have certainly done that where there's certain things. And of course, if we are indeed, coming out of this, which does seem like we are, all of those opportunities and invitations are back now where people are like, oh, do you want to host this thing? And do you want to partner, and the discipline of having to say, no, actually, this is the main thing. And we don't want to fill up their lives and their calendar. And I don't want another thing to show up to. I need some time with my family. I need some time with the Lord. So yeah, I think we have definitely gone through that exercise. We just had a day offsite with New Life Downtown, the congregation that I get to shepherd and lead. And I had 3 questions on the whiteboard. What are the things we want to preserve? What are the things we want to prune? And what are the things we want to pioneer? And to me, that's a bit of an upside down pyramid. The things we preserve, that's going to be the largest category. The things we prune will be the middle. And then the things we pioneer. Like there's a few little things that we learned during the pandemic, whether that's technology assisted or whatever, some other ways of facilitating things that maybe we want to continue. But I think every pastor should take that kind of inventory. What do we preserve? What do we prune? What do we pioneer?
One of the things that strikes me, and we're going to wrap up here in a minute, about both your book, your example, and other stuff you and I have talked about over the years, ultimately, it takes a really secure pastor to be willing to let go of their people, right? To say, we don't have to occupy 100% of your time. We don't have to have you in the church multiple days a week. I can bless what you're called to do out in the world rather than just recruit you to come do what I want to do in the world. And throughout the book, the resilient pastor, if I could impose this definition on it, is part of a huge piece of it. It's the pastor for whom their calling is secure, and they're not looking at other people to validate their calling. Which means they don't all have to come hear me preach every week. I don't have to do everything under the sun for them. I don't need their time and energy. There's something freeing about the person who's no longer trying to use people.
Yes.
So you've been through so many interesting pieces of the New Life journey in Colorado. From, you mentioned Ted Haggard's implosion, the mega church model, the city church. What do you see on the horizon? We'll wrap up with this. What do you think is the next journey for you personally as a pastor that you are ready to grow into, that you anticipate is just over the horizon?
I mean, personally, writing the chapter on formation was the most challenging one for me, because as I thought about an apprenticing community, I thought I want us to get better. I want to get better at how do we facilitate that. But you're right. A lot of that means taking our hands off the wheel. It means doing exactly what Ephesians 4 says. We're supposed to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. So eventually, if we can train and facilitate and really kind of put the train tracks down, they ought to be able to run in mentoring and discipling each other and that sort of thing. So that's a place that I'm challenged. But the other place that I'm challenged is the idea of being a collaborative church. One of the final chapters of the book, I talk about 3 layers of collaboration. One is symbiotic influence, where with different streams, and I've experienced that, where Anglican liturgy and charismatic worship and theological teaching and preaching, we're trying to blend sort of influences in a creative way. And I think the future of the church is going to require us to give and receive a bit of that symbiosis of influence and of values and of traditions, if you will. Our to use that metaphor, that old phrase, all the streams need to flow as one river here within Christianity, within the Christian tradition, where we can learn from each other more. So I think there's a lot of growth. And if America were to look to the UK and to see what's happening over there, you'll recognize that those denominational lines are not as rigid, because it's a matter of faithfulness and perseverance to say, look, we're going to need each other here. So let's figure out ways that we can strengthen each other. And then maybe another layer of collaboration is this sort of missional partnerships. I'm encouraged by the number of churches that don't feel the need to reinvent the wheel and put their name on a new program that they created, a new initiative that they created, but rather that it can truly be something that's, this is another iteration of that. Yeah, let's do that. I mean, Alpha is a great example of this. Yeah. We do Alpha, as opposed to saying, well, no, we'll come up with our own thing. And to be honest, 8 years ago, whatever, when I heard about Alpha, I thought, we could create something like that. And then I thought, why are we doing that? Mm-hmm. So this idea of missional partnerships where the pressure is not on. And then finally, healthy teams within the church, where we're moving away from the super individual, usually the super man, and to say, what if we have teams of different giftings, different voices, different perspectives, and in some ways, all of that is an answer to that impossible vocational challenge of the pastor, who's supposed to be priest, theologian, CEO, counselor, activist, and more.
Right.
And to say, no, hang on, there's ways of living this out, but not alone, together.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, thank you so much for the book and for digging through all that data and research and making it accessible. And you model that in the book, really, because this isn't just your wisdom. You are drawing from history, from different traditions. You have Jesuit theologians in here, you have Anglicans, you have Pentecostals, and then you bring in contemporary voices as well. So it's, in a way, you're modeling what it means to be a resilient pastor, even in the way you've written this. And thank you for the reminder that we need to slow down and actually be with Christ and learn to pay attention to him. If we're not doing that, we have nothing to offer the world. So if you are a church leader, please pick up The Resilient Pastor. And you guys have a podcast out that you're talking about a lot of these ideas. Give us a minute on the podcast. How's that going?
Yeah, it's great. It's called the Resilient Pastor Podcast, and we're going to also hope to launch a cohort out of it. I mean, what we're trying to do, Skye, is just get pastors in a setting where they can talk to one another, encourage one another, recognize that they're not alone. So yeah, and you can find all of that barna.com/resilientpastor, and it links to some of the resources we're partnering to create.
Great. Glenn, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Skye.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.